The mystery of Corban. That's the next one idea on One Gospel. He said to them, "Well, why do you reject and transgress the commandment of God, so that you may keep your tradition? For God, through Moses, commanded, 'Honor your father and your mother, and he who curses the father or mother, let him be put to death.' But you say, if a man will say to his father or mother, 'Out of what you might have been assisted by me is Corban,' that is an offering. You no longer allow him to honor or do anything for his father or his mother. Indeed, you have rendered the word and commandment of God void through your tradition, which you have delivered. And many things like this you do." So, what did Jesus... Okay, what's the context of what we just read? So, first of all, that's Jesus talking. He's talking to Pharisees who specifically, with teachers of the law, also called scribes, went up to Jesus. This is in Galilee, and they were chastising him and his disciples for not washing their hands before they eat, which would, by their standards, make them unclean. So he turns it on them and says, yeah, well, you do this. So that's the context. But what is he talking about? So we're going to our one idea of the day is we're going to actually tell you what Corban is, because I've heard simple definitions. I've heard like kind of very extensive politically charged definitions, but let's just look at the actual sources and say, what is Corban? You okay with that, Holly?
Yes.
And and this may sound like some esoteric topic, but this is actually relevant. So that's why we're sharing it this morning. So the word Corban is a Hebrew, Aramaic, and Arabic word, and it means sacrifice. So it goes back as far as the Hebrew Bible, and it goes forward after this time period into the Quran, because there are actually sacrifices that Muslims do, in case some of you listening aren't aware of that. In the Hebrew Bible, it is animal sacrifices in the books of Leviticus, Numbers, and Ezekiel. So, and it's translated in the King James, which is one of the English translations. It's translated as offering, oblation, or sacrifice. So they mix it up, but it's the same word. However, in Nehemiah, which is later than any of those other books, it's also referring to a wood offering. So it tells you that there could have been an evolution where it's no longer just talking about animal sacrifices, and it's going to a wider definition of offerings in general. In the Gospels, it's only used once. There's and then there's just once that a related word, Corbanus, is used, where it's commonly translated as treasury. So you wouldn't even know it has any relation to Corban at all unless you look at the Greek. So this is where it comes from.
The chief priests took the silver pieces and said, "It is not Torah compliant to put them into the treasury of Corban, since it is the price of blood." Okay,
so the chief priests were in charge of this treasury of Corban. And this is, Holly, do you actually recognize where this is from?
Yeah, they're talking about Judas.
Right. So they had paid Judas to betray Jesus, and he gave it back to them. And they said, well, we can't put that into the treasury of Corban. So the only first century primary source other than the Bible that describes what Corban is from the historian Josephus. And we get a lot of insight from this. So we're going to read those quotes. So he says in a letter against Apion that it is a thing devoted to God by an oath.
For it is very truly affirmed of this Pythagoras that he took a great many of the laws of the Jews into his own philosophy. Nor was our nation unknown of old to several of the Grecian cities, and indeed was thought worthy of imitation of some of them. This is declared by Theophrastus in his writings concerning laws, for he says that the laws of the Tyrians forbid men to swear foreign oaths, among which he enumerates some others, and particularly that called Corban, which oath can only be found among the Jews, and declares when a man may call a thing devoted to God.
So the context of this is he's saying, hey, the Jewish scriptures, its laws, its traditions were well known in the ancient world, going back a long ways. And he gives as an example the fact that one of these Greek cities actually had something called Corban, which couldn't have come from anywhere else except from Israel. But he gives you in the process a definition. He says it's what a man may call a thing devoted to God, which tells you that yes, it is a devoted offering, but it's complicated enough that he's saying, well, a man may call this. He's kind of implying that there's more to it than that, but he's not going to take the space to explain it. Would you agree with that, Holly?
Yes, indeed.
Indeed. Okay, this is the next quote. So, and the last quote. We're not going to give you a million, sadly. So, he defines Corban as people. So, not just an offering, but people who dedicate themselves via a sacred vow as a gift to God.
Moreover, when any have made a sacred vow, I mean those that are Nazarites, that suffer their hair to grow long, and use no mind, when they consecrate their hair and offer it into sacrifice, they are allot that hair for the priests to be thrown into the fire. Such also as dedicate themselves to God as Corban, which denotes what the Greeks called a gift, when they are desirous of being freed from the administration, are to lay down money for the priests, 30 shekels if it be a woman, and 50 if it be a man. But if any be too poor to pay the appointed sum, it shall be lawful for the priest to determine that sum as they think fit.
Okay, so we're going to explain what this Nazarite vow is, but at least you can see here that a Nazarite is someone that dedicated themselves to serving God in some way. And the only way they can be freed from that vow and then become a free person is to give money. But the person themselves who's under this, we're going to call it a burden of their oath, they themselves are called Corban. Okay, so we're going to explain the law of the Nazarite to explain where that came from and how did it change. So Numbers 6 explains the law of the Nazarite. Those who take a vow to separate themselves to Yahweh, the God of Israel, for a set period of time. A Nazarite, at the end of their time of service, then they make a series of offerings. And those series of offerings is specifically called Corban at 2 different places.
And this is the law of the Nazarite. When the days of his separation are fulfilled, he shall be brought unto the door of the tabernacle of the congregation, and he shall offer his offering Corban unto the Lord, 1 he lamb of the first year without blemish for burnt offering, and 1 ewe lamb of the first year without blemish for sin offering, and 1 ram without blemish for peace offerings, and a basket of unleavened bread, cakes of fine flour mingled with oil, and wafers of unleavened bread, anointed with oil, in their meat offering and their drink offerings. And the priest shall bring them before the Lord, and shall offer his sin offering and his burnt offering. And he shall offer the ram for a sacrifice of peace offerings unto the Lord with the basket of unleavened bread. The priest shall offer his meat. offering and his drink offering. And the Nazarite shall shave the head of separation at the door of the tabernacle of the congregation, and shall take the hair of the head of his separation and put it on fire, which is under the sacrifice of the peace offerings. And the priest shall take the sodden shoulder of the ram and one unleavened cake out of the basket, and one unleavened wafer, and shall put them upon the hands of the Nazarite, after the hair of his separation is shaven. And the priest shall wave them for a wave offering before the Lord. This is holy for priests, with the wave breast and heaved shoulder. And after that, the Nazarite may drink wine. This is the law of the Nazarite, who hath vowed, and of his offering, Corban, unto the Lord for his separation. Besides that, his hand shall get according to the vow which he vowed. So he must do after the law of his separation.
Okay, so this is a little bit clouded in mystery. What is a Nazarite? We actually talked about that a while back when we were talking about, is John the Baptist a Nazarite or not? But you have a person, a Nazarite. They're not a priest, they're not a Levite, but they want to dedicate themselves to God in some way. So that's why they're calling it the days of his separation. He's just separating himself from his ordinary life in order to do something for God. The only Nazarite that we are aware of in the Hebrew scriptures is Samson, the famous judge who let his hair grow long and he beat up in a big way many Philistines. And when his hair was cut, he lost his power, basically. But here you have someone that separates themselves for God's purpose, and so during this time they let their hair grow. At the end of their time, they give a series of sacrifices, but they call the series of sacrifices Corban as a group. And part of that sacrifice would also presumably be considered shaving your head, because now you're not letting your hair grow long anymore, and that hair is actually being burnt. So it's a burnt offering as part of the Corban. So it could be this is the kernel of truth that turned into something later, where the person was declared Corban because the hair on their head ultimately was going to be part of the sacrifice. And additionally, the way Josephus made it sounded like it was a burden for the person, that they were only able to be freed from it when they gave the money, which somehow the money replaces all of these actual things that were sacrificed. So these series of sacrifices enumerated in Numbers were exchanged for silver coins. And you saw that actually Josephus, he said it was 30 for a woman, 50 for a man. Well, those prices, as it were, actually does come from Leviticus. It's interesting, though, that by the time of Josephus, both men and women were able to take a Nazarite vow and become Corban, because at least in the Torah, it only really, at least by pronouns, only seems to be referring to men. But we know that pronouns are fluid, right, Holly?
No.
Okay, Holly denies that pronouns are fluid.
Nope.
Okay. So if someone were to make this vow, whatever, and we don't even know exactly what the vow meant. Maybe it was individual, but they were vowing to, devote themselves to God in some way. So because it was going to be owed to the temple's Corban treasury at the end of their time of separation, it's possible that what Jesus was talking about is that actually the person had the money in their possession, but they're not allowed to use that money for anything else according to the scribes, the Torah teachers, because they're like, hey, you've already promised that to God. I don't care if your dad became injured and now he's going to starve to death. You can't help him. And Jesus is like, that sucks, basically. It's also possible, though, that the money was already in the temple treasury. It's possible that they gave the money up front because, the temple is actually a pretty safe place to have 30 silver coins, compared to like your house. And so, the temples probably did in some way function as a bank in the ancient world, as we think of a bank, a safe place to put your money. Actually, do you feel safe with the bank, Holly?
Not entirely.
Not entirely. Well, maybe people didn't feel entirely safe with the temple either. So it's possible that the person owed the money to the temple, but it's already there in deposit. And they're like, hey, my dad broke his leg. He's going to starve to death unless I can help him. And they're like,
nope.
And like, we don't, I don't owe you the money yet. I'll still pay you. Don't worry. And they're like, no, it's God's money. F you, buddy. Mm-hmm. And so it's also possible that that's how it went too. So really the priests were functioning as bankers, and they were...
banksters.
Yeah, banksters. That sounds conspiratorial, Holly. Okay, so if that's how it was going, this makes merchandise of people. It basically turns them into money. And, Peter specifically condemns that.
But there are false prophets also among the people, even as there shall be false teachers among you, who privily shall bring in damnable heresies, even denying the Lord that brought them, and bring upon themselves swift destruction. And many shall follow their pernicious ways, by reason of whom the way of truth shall be evil spoken of. And through covetousness shall they with vain words make merchandise of you, whose judgment now of a long time lingereth not, and their damnation slumbereth not.
Okay. And I say, I'm going to get to the Zion Gospel variant in a second, but just to finish on the 2 Peter quote, he says, with feigned words, so with false words, through their own covetousness, that they want their own stuff, they're going to make merchandise of you. So I think that there's a decent chance that the scribes and the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the priests, the people, the religious leaders of the time of Jesus really thought of people as, like, they thought of them as the same way that a corporation thinks of people as, sources of income. Mm-hmm. What do you think, Holly? Is there a chance for that?
Yep.
Okay. Now, this next line is a little mysterious, so don't worry, we're going to fix it. It says the Zion Gospel variant seems to imply that Corban was funds controlled by the religious leaders, and people were supported with the Corban money. So you're like, oh my gosh, where does that come from? Well, I got to flip back because it's here. Okay, so if you look at footnote 2391, so on the right is kind of the more extensive using Hebrew words version of OneGospel. I always read from the left because it's easier to read. That's the more modern English version. So the word offering, and you see it's green. It's green because it was both in Matthew and Mark. So in the Zion Gospel was basically Hebrew versions of Matthew that date back to the Middle Ages, and some people believe that they're actually represent much older Hebrew Matthew traditions. And so the Zion gospel, instead of having the word offering, it'll say, but you say, if a man shall say to his father or mother, out of what you might have been assisted by me is Corban, I'm saying this wrong, but Corban is what you should obtain from us. So, I'm stumbling a little bit, sorry, but the Zion gospel, it's instead of the word offering, it has Corban is what you should obtain from us. Actually, it's probably after the word offering. So it's saying, but you say, if a man shall say to his father or mother, out of what you might have been assisted by me is Corban, that is an offering. Corban is what you should obtain from us. So you'd say, well, who's the us? Well, the us at the time would have been the people that Jesus was talking to. So the Pharisees and the scribes are actually controlling the Corban. So, and this is actually where you kind of get into the alternative historical and economic theories of what Corban was. They actually thought Corban was actually like the ancient world's version of socialism. So they're saying, instead of you taking care of your parents are supposed to get the Corban from the temple, because everyone was supposed to pay into the temple, and then the temple was going to, like, at least they offered to take care of people. Yeah, I know. Pretty wild, huh? So anyway, but I gotta tell you, it's possible. It's possible. But we're not going to go further into it, because that's just a tiny little that's a Middle Ages variant that may or may not be something real. Okay, so this is the other direction it could be that's closer to the time. So it's also possible that the person doesn't really want to take care of their parent, and they are using an excuse that their Corban status, where they are devoted to holy purposes and therefore exempt from that obligation. Because remember, Josephus called the people Corban, right? So if someone says, well, Dad, I'm sorry you broke your leg and you're going to starve to death, but, I'm Corban, which means that everything I'm doing now is dedicated to God. So I really, I would have taken care of you if I wasn't Corban, but I'm Corban, so tough luck. And Jesus could just be saying to the scribes, to the Torah teachers, that you allow people to do this and you suck. Mm-hmm. Paul addresses this same kind of attitude in the early church, saying that to not support your widowed mother is to deny the faith. So at that time, there could have been people that they're like, hey, I've joined this new group of Jesus followers. I'm devoted to God, and like my old obligations in the world, I don't need anymore. And Paul is probably specifically saying, well, you suck. So here we go.
But if any widow have children or nephews, let them learn first to shew piety at home, and to requite their parents, for that is good and acceptable before God. Now she that is a widow indeed, and desolate, trusteth in God, and continueth in supplications and prayers night and day. But she that liveth in pleasure is dead while she liveth. In these things give in charge, that they may be blameless. But if any provide not for his own, and especially for those of his own house, he hath denied the faith, and is worse than an infidel.
Yes, an infidel means unbeliever. So it says, if any provide not for his own, especially for those of his own house, he has denied the faith and is worse than an infidel. So Paul was saying for these early Christian communities where they did help each other. We're not going to go into that deeply, but the first Christian communities were truly like communitarian living, where everything went into the same pot. Now, by the time Paul was writing this letter in 1 Timothy, it may not have looked exactly like that in the Gentile communities that he helped found and helped guide over time, but they still were clearly looking out for each other, and that starts with, because he said, especially for those of your own house. So providing for your own, what started with your own house, but was a larger group of people outside of that. Mm-hmm. And so could that just mean your extended family? It could, but it probably also meant the way they organized themselves to take care of themselves outside of the Roman system, because the Romans had their own bread and circuses, right? They had their own system, and it's quite probable that the Christians were outside of that, because that system involved giving sacrifices to idols and then spreading that meat out, and they didn't want to take part in it, and so they really had parallel systems at the time. So he's saying, listen, you can say you're devoted to God, but if you're not providing for the people around you, you've completely lost the point. So what is the point? So Holly, what do you think the point is? What did you take from this?
I think the point is that you should take care of your family members, and that's how you're showing your love for God. And to try to get out of it by making some kind of vow and pretending that that obligation is not there is not something that we should do as Christians.
I think that is the immediate point. Jesus is saying, hey, you tell people they don't have to take care of their parents because what you would have taken care of them was devoted to God. And so whether that's coming from the institutional end or the individual end or both, I'm going to say both. That's clearly the immediate. But it also, this whole exploring the concept of Corban tells us that there's something deeper going on, that religious institutions used people's well-meaning desire to devote themselves to God to actually control them economically. Would you say that's also something in there?
Yeah. Controlling the people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, making merchandise of them.
Yeah.
And so when you see that, I think most people today will be like, yeah, you should probably take care of your parents when they need help. Didn't they take care of you when you were little? At least most parents do.
Well, and in sort of a way, it made me think of an indulgence. It's a little different, but paying money to be freed from an obligation. Yeah. And the religious institution benefiting from that.
Yeah, back then it was religious, but everything that was religious, that was political. Mm-hmm. And today, everything that's political has the tinge of religion. Mm-hmm. And so the nations do the same thing. Mm-hmm. They treat people like commodities.
That's a good word for it.
They will oppress people to the point where they can't even take care of their own parents because the state owns them. Mm-hmm. So maybe the point also goes a little deeper. And it's not a cry for revolution as much as it's just a point of, that feeling you get that things aren't right. Well, I think, Jesus would have said the same thing. This isn't how things are supposed to be.